The notice had been pinned to the servants' door before dawn, and by the time Eleanor read it, the ink had already begun to blur in the damp. 3 new rules for the night of the ball, written in the steward's careful hand. No servant was to speak unless spoken to. No servant was to linger in the lit rooms once a tray was emptied. And no servant, under any circumstance, was to be seen wearing anything that might be mistaken for the dress of a guest. She read it twice, standing in the cold passage with her breath showing white, and then she went to find her plainest cloak. It was grey, the colour of a winter sky that has forgotten how to hold light, and it had belonged first to her mother and then to no one at all for 3 years before Eleanor took it up again. The wool had thinned at the elbows. The hem carried the memory of every kitchen floor she had ever crossed. She had a better cloak, a deep green one given to her at Christmas by the cook who pitied her, but she left the green one folded in the trunk beneath her narrow bed and reached for the grey. On a night when the whole house would blaze with candles and silk, she meant to be a shadow that carried plates. She meant to be unseen. It was, she had learned, the safest thing a woman in her position could be. Eleanor Hartley was 26, and she had been in service at Ashcombe for 11 years. She had come to the great house at 15 with nothing but a change of linen and a letter from the vicar who had known her father, and she had climbed from scullery to kitchen to the dining-room floor by being quiet, quick, and impossible to fault. She knew the weight of a full soup tureen carried at a half-run. She knew which of the footmen drank, and which of the maids wept in the linen-room, and which of the family were cruel for sport, and which only from carelessness. She knew the house the way a sailor knows a ship, by feel in the dark, and she had long ago stopped imagining that any part of its brightness would ever belong to her. Her mother had been a governess once, in a better house than this, before a foolish marriage and a young widowhood had brought her down in the world by degrees. The way a leaf comes down, turning, she had taught Eleanor her letters and her figures, and a great deal more besides, how to read a room, how to hold her tongue, how to keep a straight back under a heavy tray. She had died when Eleanor was 17, of a fever that ran through the servants' quarters one hard winter, and she had left her daughter 2 things. She had left her the grey cloak, and she had left her a single piece of counsel, spoken in the last clear hour before the fever took her wits. You can tell everything about a person, her mother had said, by how they speak to those who can do nothing for them. Eleanor had carried the saying with her for 9 years, and in 9 years of service she had watched it prove true again and again, and it had never once proved true in her favour. The great and the grand who passed through Ashcombe spoke to her, when they spoke to her at all, as they might speak to a chair that had inconvenienced them by being in the way. She had grown so used to it that she no longer felt it as a wound, only as weather, a cold that one dressed against and stopped remarking. A guest had once handed her his empty glass, without looking at her, in the middle of a sentence spoken to someone else, the way a man sets down a thing he has finished with, and she had taken it and carried it away and thought nothing of it, and only later, alone, had she remembered her mother in the good years, in the better house, before the fall, and had wondered what her mother would have made of the woman her daughter had become, quiet and useful and invisible, a pair of hands that carried glasses. She did not wonder it often. Wondering it did no good, and Eleanor had long ago put away the things that did no good, folded them and set them at the bottom of a trunk in her heart, the way she had folded away the green cloak she never wore. The ball that night was the largest Ashcombe had hosted in a generation. The old Baron had died in the spring, and his heir, a nervous young man with more debts than sense, had decided that the way to repair the family's standing was to fling open the doors and invite every family of consequence within 40 miles. There would be dancing until the small hours. There would be a supper laid at midnight that had taken the kitchen 4 days to prepare. And there would be, the whole household whispered, a guest of such rank that the young Baron had scarcely dared to hope he would come. A duke. A real duke, from the north, a man whose name Eleanor had heard spoken the way other people spoke of weather that might ruin a harvest, with a mixture of awe and dread. She did not care about the duke. Dukes were nothing to her but more mouths to feed, and more floors to clear. What she cared about that evening, as she tied the grey cloak at her throat and pinned back the dark hair that would not stay pinned, was getting through the night without dropping a single glass and without being noticed by the young Baron's mother, who had a way of finding fault that could cost a girl a month's wages with one flick of her fan. The kitchen, when she came down, was a furnace of noise and heat. Cook stood at the centre of it like a general at a siege, red-faced and roaring, and the spits turned, and the great copper pots hissed, and a boy no older than 10 ran back and forth with his arms full of kindling and his eyes wide with terror and delight. Eleanor took her place at the long table where the trays were being loaded, and she worked. And for a long while she thought of nothing but the work. The younger maids around her chattered of the Duke as they filled the trays, of whether he was handsome, of whether it was true he had turned to stone with grief, of which of the county's daughters might catch him, and Eleanor said nothing and thought that a duke was as far from any of them as the moon, and none of their business, and let them talk. It was near 10 o'clock when she was sent up with the first tray of wine into the lit rooms, and it was there, in the great hall with its blaze of candles and its crush of silk and jewels, that she first saw the man by the window. He stood apart from the crowd, which was the first thing she noticed, because no one of any importance ever stood apart at a ball. Importance gathered. Importance clustered at the centre of the brightest light and drew the room toward it. But this man had placed himself in the deep bay of the far window, half in shadow, a glass in his hand that he did not seem to be drinking from, and he watched the dancing the way Eleanor herself watched it, from the edge, as something happening to other people. He was tall and plainly dressed for such a gathering, in dark clothes without ornament, and his face when the candlelight caught it was neither young nor old, but somewhere in the weathered country between, a face that had known sun and wind, and some private grief it had not yet finished with. She would not have looked twice, except that as she passed with her tray, he spoke to her. They dance as though the world will end at dawn. He murmured it into the noise, and it was not a question, and it did not seem to require an answer, but he had said it to her, the way one says a thing to the only other sober person in a room full of the drunk. Eleanor stopped. A servant did not stop unless bidden, but something in the dry weariness of his voice had caught her, and before she could measure the wisdom of it she had answered, "Perhaps they hope it will." She had stopped without meaning to. A great many of them would be glad of a fresh start. He turned his head and looked at her then, fully, for the first time, and she saw that his eyes were a pale grey that missed nothing. For an instant she was afraid, because she had spoken above her station to a guest, and the rules pinned to the servant's door that morning flashed cold behind her eyes. But he did not look offended. He looked, of all things, interested, a fresh start. He repeated the words slowly, as though weighing them. "You believe such a thing is possible. I believe people believe in it. Whether it comes is another matter." She should have moved on. She knew she should have moved on, but he had set his glass down on the sill, untouched, and he was studying her grey cloak, and her reddened hands, and the plain white cap that marked her out as clearly as a brand. And something in his study was without contempt, and that was so rare that she stood one moment longer than she ought. "You are one of the household," he observed. "I serve here. Yes, and you find the whole affair foolish. I find it a great deal of work." She met his eyes as she said it, and to her astonishment, the corner of his mouth moved, almost into a smile, the first she had seen on him. An honest answer. He inclined his head a fraction, as though she had done him a service. "I have been at this ball for 2 hours, and it is the first one I have received." Someone called out across the room a bright false laugh, and the moment thinned, and Eleanor remembered herself. She inclined her head the way a servant did, and she carried her tray on into the crowd. And she did not look back at the man in the window, though she felt his pale gaze follow her the length of the hall. She told herself he was only a country gentleman of no particular rank, some cousin or hanger-on. A man as out of place among the silk and jewels as she was herself. There was comfort in the thought. It let her forget him. She did not forget him. Through the long hours of that night, as she carried wine and cleared glasses and stood pressed against the wall waiting to be needed, she found her eyes returning to the deep bay of the window where the dark, quiet man had stood. Sometimes he was there. More often he was moving slowly through the rooms, and she noticed that he spoke to few, and that those few were never the ones who most wished to be spoken to. The young Baron pursued him about the hall like a spaniel, and the Baron's mother arranged her daughters in his path like flowers set out for cutting. And the man moved through all of it with a courtesy so complete it was nearly a wall, giving nothing, promising nothing, escaping. Eleanor watched the mother work, and felt, despite herself, a flicker of something almost like pity for the two daughters, who had been dressed and curled and paraded since childhood for exactly this, and who danced now with bright fixed smiles under their mother's eye, wanting a thing they had been taught to want, and had never been asked whether they wanted. They were prisoners of the great bright room as surely as Eleanor was a servant in it, and neither of them, she thought, would ever be spoken to as a person by the sad dark man they had been set to catch, because they did not know how to speak to anyone as a person, having never once in their lives been permitted to be simply themselves. It was the first time it had ever occurred to Eleanor that there might be worse cages than her own. Once, near the great fireplace, she watched a small thing happen that she did not understand until much later. An old woman, some poor relation of the family brought in to make up the numbers, had dropped her fan in the crush and could not stoop to reach it, and the fine young people stepped around her and past her as though she were furniture. And it was the dark man from the window who crossed the room unhurried and bent and picked up the fan and returned it to her hands, and stood a moment and spoke with her, gravely, as though she were the most important person in the room, until the old woman's frightened face softened and warmed. No one else remarked it. Eleanor, standing against the wall with her empty tray, remarked it, and something her mother had said 9 years before stirred at the back of her mind, and she did not yet know why. Near midnight, when the supper was laid and the crush thickened, and the heat of 100 candles had made the great hall close as a held breath, Eleanor slipped out through a side door into the cold of the stone corridor to catch her breath. And it was there, in the near dark, that she found him again. He was standing at the tall corridor window, looking out at the snow that had begun to fall across the black lawns, and he did not turn when she came out, though he must have heard the door. "I beg your pardon." She made to withdraw at once. "I did not know the corridor was taken. It is not taken." He spoke without turning. "It is escaped to. Stay, you look as though you need the cold as much as I do." She hesitated. Every rule she had ever been taught told her to go. But her feet ached, and her head swam with heat and noise, and the snow beyond the glass was falling soft and silent and clean. And she was tired, so tired, of being careful. She stayed. For a while neither of them spoke. The snow came down. Somewhere behind the thick door the music went on, muffled now, a distant brightness like a fire seen through fog. You do not enjoy it. She had come to stand a little nearer the glass. The ball, any of it. No, the word was flat and final. "I came because I was asked, and because there was a matter I thought to settle here. I did not expect to enjoy it. I am not disappointed." He turned then and looked at her in the faint snowlight. "And you? This is your life. Every night such a crush. Not every night." She almost smiled. "Most nights are only work without the silk. The silk is for the guests." "What is it for you then, the nights?" No one had asked her such a thing in 11 years. She found she did not know how to answer it, and so she answered it truly, which was the only way she knew. Bread and mending, mostly, a book if I can get one and a candle to read it by. Sunday if the weather holds, a walk to the top of the ridge above the house where you can see the whole valley. That is the best of it, standing up there with the wind and the whole green world laid out and no one wanting anything from me. She stopped, surprised at herself. "You did not ask for all of that?" I asked, "and I am glad of the answer. It is a better answer than any I have had tonight from anyone in silk." He looked at her a moment longer. "What is your name?" "Eleanor." She gave the name almost before she decided to. And then, because it seemed the corridor and the snow and the strange dark quiet of him invited it, "Eleanor Hartley." Eleanor Hartley. He said it the way a man reads a line he means to remember. He did not give her his own name in return, and she did not think it strange, because gentlemen did not give their names to servant girls, and she had already understood him to be a gentleman of some sort, if a poorer one than the crowd inside. "Go back to your work, Eleanor Hartley, gently now, before you are missed and it goes hard for you. But I am glad to have escaped to the same corridor." She went. At the door she looked back once, and he had turned again to the snow, a dark, still shape against the falling white. And she carried the picture of him back into the heat and the noise, and it warmed her, absurdly, through the long remainder of that endless night. The ball ended near 4 in the morning. The last carriages crunched away over the frozen gravel, and the great house sighed and guttered and slowly went dark, and Eleanor fell into her narrow bed as the sky beyond the little window was just beginning to grey, and she slept as though she had been struck down. She learned the truth 2 days later, and she learnt it in the cruellest possible way. The household had been in a fever since the morning after the ball, and Eleanor, who kept apart from gossip when she could, had gathered only that some great matter had passed, and that the young Baron was beside himself. It was the cook who told her, at last, wiping her red hands on her apron and shaking her head at the wonder of it. A duke, cook told her, a true duke, come all the way from the north, and do you know he scarcely danced, scarcely spoke to a soul the whole night. The mistress paraded both her girls before him and got nothing for it, not a word, and she is spitting fury over it now, I can tell you. The Duke of Wexford himself, under this roof, and he wandered the halls like a ghost, and left before dawn. She lowered her voice. "They say he is looking for a wife, been a widower these 5 years, and never once looked at another woman, and here was every family in the county setting out their daughters like a market, and he would have none of them." Off he went into the snow. Grief, they say. His first wife died young, and he has never got over it. A cold man, they call him now. Turned to stone. Eleanor had gone very still over the pot she was scrubbing. What did he look like? Her voice did not sound like her own. "Oh, tall," cook answered. Dark plain in his dress for a duke, they said, no jewels, no gold, nothing to mark him out. Kept to the windows all night, apparently. A strange, sad sort of man. The pot slipped in Eleanor's hands and struck the stone floor with a great flat clang, and cook scolded her, and Eleanor bent to retrieve it with her face turned away so that the older woman would not see what had come into it. Because she knew now. She knew whose grey eyes had missed nothing, and whose quiet had been a wall, and whose weary voice had said that the dancers hoped the world would end at dawn. She had stood beside the Duke of Wexford in a cold corridor and told him about bread and mending and the ridge above the house, and she had not known him, and he had let her not know him, and now he was gone into the north, and she would never see him again as long as she lived. She should have felt nothing. He was a duke, and she was a scullery-risen dining-maid in a borrowed grey cloak, and the whole world lay between them, wide as an ocean and just as cold. There was nothing there to grieve, and yet for 3 days Eleanor Hartley moved through the great house like a woman who had lost something, and she could not have said what, and she was angry at herself for the losing of it, and she climbed to the top of the ridge that Sunday and stood in the wind with the whole white valley laid out below her, and she found that the best of her life had gone thin and grey as her mother's cloak, and she did not know how to make it bright again. It was on the ridge, standing in that wind, that she understood the small thing she had seen by the fireplace. A great duke, who could have any door in England opened to him, had crossed a crowded room to pick up an old poor woman's fan, a woman who could do nothing for him, nothing at all, and he had spoken to her as though she mattered, and he had spoken to a dining-maid the same way, in a corridor, in the snow. You can tell everything about a person, her mother had said, by how they speak to those who can do nothing for them. Eleanor stood on the ridge and understood, too late, exactly what manner of man had asked her name, and she was more sorry than she had ever been for anything, and she did not fully know why. What she could not have known, standing there in the March wind, was that far to the north the Duke was passing his own bad nights. He had gone home to a house that was too large and too quiet, a house that had been quiet for 5 years, since the fever that took the county had reached even into his high stone rooms and taken from him the young wife he had married for love against the counsel of everyone who knew him. He had loved her plainly and completely, and when she died he had discovered that grief, in a man of his kind, does not roar. It settles, it becomes the temperature of the rooms. He had gone about the long business of his estates with a still face and an empty chest, and the whole world had watched him harden and had called it dignity, and had set its daughters before him year after year as though a new young wife were a thing that could be poured into the hollow place and fill it. He had refused them all. He had not refused them out of loyalty to the dead, though the county liked to say so. He had refused them because not one of them had ever, in 5 years, spoken to him as though he were a living man. They spoke to the title. They spoke to the valleys and the great house and the seat in the north. He had come to feel that he had died along with his wife, and that only his rank went on walking about in his clothes, receiving visitors, being flattered, being wed to in the imaginations of ambitious mothers, and that the man himself was somewhere else entirely, standing at a window, looking out at snow. And then a servant girl in a grey cloak had told him that the dancers hoped the world would end at dawn, and had said it dryly, to him, to the man and not the title, because she had not known there was a title to speak to. She had asked nothing of him. She had wanted nothing from him. She had answered his questions truly, and had gone back to her work, and he had stood in a cold corridor and felt, for the first time in 5 years, the temperature of a room change. He had ridden north with her voice in his ears, and for 2 months he had told himself he was a foolish old man clutching at the strangeness of a single night. And for 2 months the voice had not faded, and in the end he had sat down at his own desk with his own plain hand and written the truth to a woman he had met once, because a man who has been dead for 5 years does not throw away the first hour in which he has felt alive. Winter closed over Ashcombe. The snow came and stayed and came again. The young baron, having failed to catch his duke, turned his attention to catching a rich wife instead, and the house sank into the long grey business of getting through the cold months, and Eleanor worked, and mended, and read her books by her stub of candle, and slowly, she taught herself not to think of a dark man at a window. She was good at teaching herself not to want things. It was, after all, the great skill of her life. She had almost succeeded when the letter came. It came in the last week of February, carried through the melting slush by a rider whose horse was better than any Ashcombe kept, and it was addressed, in a firm black hand, not to the Baron, but to Miss Eleanor Hartley, and its seal was the seal of a great northern house, and when the housekeeper brought it down to the kitchen, the whole room fell silent as a church. Eleanor did not open it there. She could not have borne the eyes. She carried it up to her cold little room under the roof, and she sat on her narrow bed, with her heart going like a hammer, and she broke the seal at last with fingers that would not keep still. The hand was firm and plain, like the man. He did not waste words. Miss Hartley, it read, "I have thought of our conversation in the corridor every day since I left Ashcombe, which is more than I can say of any conversation I have had in 5 years. You spoke to me as though I were a man and not a title, because you did not know I was anything else, and I have found since that I cannot go back to being spoken to any other way. I am aware of everything that stands between us. I am aware of what the world will say. I find that at this stage of my life I care for the world's saying less than I once did. I am coming to Ashcombe again in the 2nd week of March, and this time I come as myself, and I would ask you, if you are willing, to walk with me to the top of that ridge you spoke of, and show me the valley. Nothing more than that. A walk, and your company, and the truth between us at last. If you would rather I did not come, send back one word by this same rider and I will never trouble you again. But I do not think you will. I think you felt it, too. Wexford. Eleanor read the letter 4 times. Then she folded it and pressed it flat against her chest, and sat for a long while in the cold, with her eyes shut, and something breaking open in her that she had kept locked so long she had forgotten she owned it. She did not send back the word. He came in the 2nd week of March, as he had promised, and he came without ceremony, in a plain travelling coach with a single servant. And he did not go up to the great house to be fawned over by the Baron. He came instead to the kitchen door, in the raw grey light of a thawing afternoon, and he stood there in his dark travelling clothes with the mud of the road on his boots, and he asked, of the astonished boy who answered, whether Miss Eleanor Hartley might be free to walk out for an hour. The kitchen, when word of it reached them, very nearly stopped its heart. Cook sat down heavily on a stool. The housekeeper's mouth opened and shut like a fish. And Eleanor, summoned from the linen room where she had been counting sheets with hands that shook, came down the stone passage in her grey cloak, her plainest cloak, the same one, because it was the only armour she had, and she stepped out into the thin March light, and there he was. He looked older in daylight than she had remembered, and more tired, and when he saw her his grave face changed the way the sky changes when the sun finds a gap in cloud. Miss Hartley. He said her name, and nothing more. Your Grace. The title sat strange and heavy in her mouth after all these weeks of thinking of him as the sad man at the window. No, he shook his head. Not that. Not from you. That is precisely the thing I came all this way to escape. He looked at her a moment. Will you walk with me? You promised me a valley. I promised you nothing. She surprised them both, for the old dry spark had come back into her voice. You promised yourself a valley, and asked if I would come along. And he laughed. It was a rusty sound, a laugh long out of use, and it seemed to surprise him more than it surprised her. And it settled something between them, and side by side, the Duke and the dining maid, they walked out from the house and up the long muddy track toward the ridge, and the whole of Ashcombe watched them go from every window it possessed. They climbed in near silence at first. The path was steep, and the ground still half frozen underfoot, and twice he put out a hand to steady her over the worst of it, and twice she took it, and each time neither of them spoke of the taking. Below them the great house shrank, and the valley opened out, brown and grey and streaked with the last of the snow in its northern folds, and the wind came clean and cold off the moor above, and when at last they stood at the top of the ridge, with the whole world laid below them, Eleanor felt the thing she always felt up there. The great loosening, the sense of no one wanting anything from her. Except that now someone did. He stood beside her, close, his dark clothes whipping in the wind, and he looked not at the valley, but at her. You were right. He drew a slow breath of the cold air. It is the best of it. I have not stood in a place like this in years. I had forgotten there was air like this in the world. You have valleys of your own, surely, grander than this one. I have a great many valleys, and there was no pride in the way he said it. I own more of England than any one man decently should, and I have not stood on the top of a single one of them since my wife died, because I could not think what any of it was for. He was quiet a moment. The wind pulled at them. You spoke to me in that corridor as though the world were still a thing worth walking out into. I had stopped believing that. I came back to see whether it was you, or whether it was only the strangeness of the night. It is you. Eleanor kept her eyes on the valley. Her heart was a wild thing in her chest, and she held it still by long habit. I am a servant. You know that. You have always known it. I scrub the pots your kind eat from. There is nothing in me that could stand beside a duke. The whole world will laugh at you, and worse, they will be cruel to me. And I have been in service long enough to know exactly how cruel they can be. I know all of that. I have thought of nothing else for 2 months. And I have come to the far side of all of it, and I find I do not care. I am 41 years old. I have spent 5 of those years turned to stone, as they all say, and I am tired of being stone. You made me a man again in a cold corridor without even knowing my name. I will not go back into the stone for the sake of what the world will say. He turned fully to face her, there on the top of the windy ridge. I am not asking you to be a duchess, Eleanor. Not yet. Not today. I am asking you to let me court you honestly, in the sight of everyone, the way a man courts a woman he has come to love. And I am asking whether in time you might come to feel for the man what you would never feel for the title. The wind roared over the top of the ridge, and the whole valley lay grey and gold below them, and Eleanor Hartley, 26, 11 years in service, stood in her mother's grey cloak beside a duke who had crossed the length of England to ask her to walk up a hill. And she found that all the careful teaching of her life, all the long hard skill of not wanting things, had finally, completely failed her. I felt it too. In the corridor. I have been ashamed of it for 2 months. I told myself it was foolishness, that a girl like me had no business feeling anything for a man at a window. She turned to look at him at last. And then your letter came, and I read it 4 times, and I have carried it against my heart every day since, and I am done, I think, with being ashamed of it. He reached out, slowly, and took a reddened, work-roughened hand in both of his, and he held it as though it was something of value, and up there on the ridge, with no witness but the wind and the wide grey valley and a single wheeling hawk, the Duke of Wexford raised the hand of the dining maid to his lips. They walked down together in the failing light, and they did not hurry, and they did not let go of one another, and the whole of Ashcombe was still watching from its windows when they came back into the yard, and Eleanor found, to her own great surprise, that she did not care in the least who watched. What followed was not easy, for the world is exactly as cruel as Eleanor had promised it would be. The Baron's mother took the news like a wound. She had paraded her own 2 daughters before the Duke through the whole long night of the ball, and been ignored for her trouble, and to see him now come courting a kitchen girl was a humiliation she could not swallow. She could not strike at the Duke, who was beyond her reach, and so she struck at Eleanor, in the small and endless ways that a mistress can strike at a servant. The work grew heavier and the hours grew longer. Faults were found where there were none. Twice the woman contrived to have Eleanor sent on some errand at the very hour the Duke was expected, so that he arrived to find her gone, and twice the Duke, understanding perfectly what had been done, simply sat himself down in the housekeeper's parlour and waited, gravely and without complaint. However long it took, until Eleanor returned, and his patience shamed the Baron's mother more than any anger could have done. Word of it ran through the county, and then through London itself, and the great families who had daughters of their own to marry off spoke the name of Wexford now with pity and contempt. The great Duke, who had lost his mind to grief and taken up with a serving girl. Letters came to Ashcombe. Some were addressed to the Duke, and he burned them unread, for he knew their like. Some were addressed to Eleanor herself, and these were the cruel ones, written in fine hands by people she had never met, telling her what she was and what she would always be, and what a woman of her station deserved for reaching above it. She read every one. She read them alone, at night by her stub of candle, and then she carried them down to the kitchen and fed them one at a time into the fire, and watched the fine hateful words go black and curl and vanish, and she said nothing to anyone, and in the morning she went back to her work with her straight back and her still face, exactly as her mother had taught her. She told the Duke of none of it, but he was not a man who missed things, and one grey afternoon in April, walking with her along the lower field, he stopped and took both her hands and looked at her with those pale eyes that saw everything. "They have been writing to you." It was not a question. Eleanor did not answer, which was answer enough. I will not insult you by pretending I can stop it. I cannot govern what small people put on paper, but I can promise you this: I will not hide you, and I will not hurry you into a corner, and I will not marry you in some dark church where no one can see, as though there were shame in it to be got over quietly. Whatever they write, they will write it in the daylight, and they will watch me court you in the daylight, and in the end they will run out of ink long before I run out of patience." He paused. "My first wife was gently born, and the whole world approved of her, and I loved her, and losing her nearly ended me. I have learned since that the world's approval is worth exactly nothing. I would rather have you and the whole county's scorn than the finest match in England and another 5 years of stone." There was one afternoon in that early spring that Eleanor kept apart from all the others in her memory, though nothing happened in it that the world would call an event. It had rained all the morning, a thin cold northern rain, and by afternoon it had cleared into that washed and trembling brightness that comes only after long wet. And the Duke had come down from the north unannounced, and found her in the kitchen garden with mud to her wrists, for the mistress had set her to the meanest work she could find that day out of pure spite. He had not minded the mud. He had taken off his own fine coat and laid it over the wall and asked her, gravely, what wanted doing, and she had stared at him, and he had waited, and in the end she had handed him a trowel, because there was nothing else to be done with a duke who would not go away, and together, the two of them, they had set out the whole of a bed of early roots in the wet spring earth, while the mistress watched thunderstruck from an upper window. They had spoken of small things while they worked, of the way a garden tells the truth about a household, of the books each of them had loved as children, of the strange fact that they had both, as children, believed the top of a hill to be the safest place in the world. And Eleanor had found, kneeling in the mud beside a man who owned half of England, that she had never in her life been so easy in anyone's company, that the careful watching part of her, the part that had stood guard for 26 years, had gone quiet at last and let her simply be. When the bed was finished, he had straightened, with mud on his knees and his sleeves rolled and rain still in his dark hair, and he had looked at her across the turned earth, and neither of them had said a word, and it had been, she thought long afterward, the exact moment she stopped being afraid of loving him. There was another day, later, in the full green of May, when he took her up to the ridge again, and they sat a long while in the grass, with the whole valley shimmering below in the heat, and he told her, quietly, of the wife he had lost, which he had never done with anyone. He told her not as a man confessing a wound, but as a man showing a friend a room in his house that he had kept locked, and Eleanor listened without a word, and did not offer him the easy comforts that people offer, and did not try to reach in and mend anything, and only sat beside him in the grass while he spoke, and that, as he said to her afterward, was the first time in 5 years that anyone had let his grief simply be a grief, without hurrying to cover it over. She understood him in that. She had carried her own griefs the same way, a mother in the ground and a childhood in a better house that was gone forever, and she knew that the cruelest thing you can do to a sorrow is to insist it cheer up. They came down from the ridge that evening later than they should have, in the long gold light, and they walked in a silence that had become, without either of them naming it, the most companionable silence either of them had ever known, and Eleanor understood that whatever the world decided about them, this was already a marriage in the only sense that had ever mattered to her. Two people who could be quiet together and not be alone. And so he courted Eleanor Hartley in the full daylight of the world's disapproval, openly, steadily, for the whole of that spring and summer. He rode down from the north again and again, and each time he came to the kitchen door and not the grand one. He walked with her on the ridge in April rain and June sun. He sat with her in the housekeeper's parlour under the scandalised eye of half of England, and he learnt the shape of her days, and she learnt the shape of his grief, and each of them found in the other a quiet that neither had known in years. He brought her no jewels, for he understood her too well for that, but once he brought her a book she had spoken of wanting and never hoped to own, and she held it as though it were the crown of England, and that, he thought, watching her, told him more than any jewel could have. But there came a day in that long summer when the whole of it very nearly broke, and it broke when it came to it, not on the world's cruelty, but on Eleanor's own pride, which was the one thing in her that ran as deep as his. It was late June, and the county had begun to soften toward them, and the Duke, wishing to show her the world she would one day enter, had arranged for her to be received at a grand house some miles distant, the seat of a family who had at last decided that curiosity outweighed contempt. Eleanor had not wanted to go. She had gone because he asked it, and she had dressed with great care in the finest gown the housekeeper could contrive for her, and she had held her straight back and her still face through a long afternoon of eyes. And it had been bearable, almost, until the moment in the drawing-room when a great lady of the party, smiling all the while, had asked Eleanor whether it was true that she had scrubbed pots, and had asked it in the particular voice that fine people keep for making a wound look like a pleasantry. And the whole room had gone soft and listening, and waited to see the servant girl flush and stammer. Eleanor had not flushed. She had looked at the great lady with her still grey eyes, and had answered that yes, she had scrubbed pots, and floors besides, and had carried coal, and had learned in 11 years of it exactly how much labour went into every hour of ease that a lady of leisure enjoyed, and that she was not ashamed of any of it, and did not intend to begin being ashamed of it now to please a room. It was the truth, and it was said quietly, and it was unanswerable, and the great lady's smile had frozen on her face, and somewhere across the room the Duke had made a sound that was almost a laugh. But the victory had cost Eleanor more than the room could see, for she had understood, standing there, that she would have to fight that same battle in some form for the rest of her life, that she would never simply be received, that every door in the Duke's world would open onto some version of that smiling wound, and that he, who had been born to those rooms, could not fully feel the weight of what he was asking her to carry. She was silent on the long drive back, and when they reached Ashcombe in the dusk, she did a thing she had never done. She told him she thought they should stop. "You have a world." She had stopped him there in the yard, in the failing light, with the horses steaming and the servant looking carefully away. "You have a world, and I have watched it today, and I do not belong in it, and I never will, and no marriage will make me belong. You will spend the rest of your life defending me in drawing-rooms, and I will spend the rest of mine being defended, and I do not think either of us will be able to bear it in the end. It is better to know it now. I would rather lose you now, cleanly, than watch you come, in 10 years, to be sorry." He did not argue with her at once. That was the thing she had not expected, and the thing that undid her. A lesser man would have protested, would have poured out promises, would have insisted that the world did not matter. He said none of that. He stood in the yard and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said that she was right about the drawing-rooms, that she would have to fight, that he could not spare her that, and that he had been wrong to pretend the fight would be small. He said he would not insult her by promising her an easy life. And then he said the thing that stayed with her all her days. "I am not asking you into my world because I think you belong in it. I am asking because I have come to think it is a poorer world than I believed, and that the little of it worth keeping I first understood in a corridor from a woman in a grey cloak. I do not want to raise you up to me, Eleanor. I want you to pull me down to something better. If you leave me now, to spare me a hard life, you will not spare me anything. You will only send me back to the stone, and I would rather have 20 hard years with you than one more easy one alone." Eleanor stood in the darkening yard and felt the last wall in her come down, the oldest one, the one her mother had built stone by stone against a world that hurt those who reached above their place. She had held it against grief and against cruelty and against loneliness for 26 years, and it fell now, all at once, before a plain-spoken man who wanted to be pulled down rather than to raise her up, and she found she was weeping, which she had not done in years, and he crossed the yard and held her while she did it, in full view of the horses and the servant and every scandalized window of the house, and neither of them cared at all. And slowly, because the world in the end respects nothing so much as a man who will not be moved, the cruelty thinned. The letters came less often, and then they stopped. The families who had laughed grew tired of laughing at a thing that would not laugh back, and one by one, first from curiosity and then from something warmer, they began to find reasons to call. The old poor relation whose fan the Duke had lifted at the ball, it turned out, had told the story to anyone who would listen, of the great sad Duke who treated an old useless woman like a queen. And the story had done its quiet work in the county's heart. By midsummer the tide had turned, and by August it had turned entirely, and the same people who had written to tell Eleanor what she was now spoke of the romance of it, the great Duke and the servant with the still face and the steady eyes, and Eleanor, who forgot nothing, watched them change their tune and said nothing, and forgave them, because her mother had also taught her that a person who cannot forgive carries the whole weight of the world's cruelty forever, and she did not mean to carry it. They were married in the last week of September, in the small grey church in the valley below the ridge, and it was not a grand wedding, because neither of them wanted one, but the church was full. It was full of the people who had known Eleanor for 11 years, the cook and the housekeeper and the footman and the 10-year-old kindling boy grown an inch taller. And it was full, too, of the great and grand who had come at first to sneer and stayed. In the end, because there was something in the sight of the two of them that shamed the sneer right out of a person. Eleanor did not wear grey. She wore a gown the colour of the valley in high summer, deep and green and gold, and when she came up the aisle on the arm of the old vicar who had known her father, the whole church rose, and the Duke waiting at the altar looked at her the way he had looked at the snow through the corridor window, as though she were the one clean, quiet thing in all the world. They spoke their vows plainly, without ornament, the way he did everything, and when it was done they walked out together into the pale gold light of an autumn afternoon, and the bells rang out over the whole valley, and up on the top of the ridge, if anyone had been standing there to see it, they would have heard the sound come faint and sweet on the wind, and rolling away across the wide green. World below, the old poor relation whose fan the Duke had lifted at the ball a year before had lived to see the wedding, and she sat near the front of the little church in her best-worn gown, and when the two of them came back down the aisle as man and wife she was weeping openly, and Eleanor, passing, stopped, and took the old woman's hands and thanked her, though neither of them could have said quite for what. Cook wept too, and pretended it was the cold, and the 10-year-old kindling boy, grown a year taller, held the church door and stood very straight and proud, as though he had arranged the whole of it himself. It was, everyone agreed afterward, a poor sort of wedding for a duke, with none of the grandeur a man of his rank might command, and it was also, everyone agreed, though they were slower to say it, the happiest wedding any of them had ever stood witness to. Eleanor kept the grey cloak. In all the years that came after, in the great northern house with its many valleys, through the long good ordinary business of a marriage that surprised the county by lasting and deepening and turning, in the end, into the kind of love that people tell stories about, she kept it folded in a trunk of cedar, her mother's thin grey cloak, the plainest thing she owned. She became in time a duchess the county spoke of, with a respect it had never given to any grand-born woman, for she carried her rank the way her mother had taught her to carry a heavy tray, with a straight back and a still face and a quiet eye for the people the world walked past. She never once, in all her years as a duchess, failed to speak to the person who could do nothing for her, and the whole north country loved her for it, and did not always know why. There were children, in time, 2 sons and a daughter, and the daughter had her mother's still grey eyes and her grandmother's gift for figures, and Eleanor taught her the same saying her own mother had given her in a fever, in the last clear hour, about how you may know a person entire by how they speak to those who can do nothing for them. She taught it to her sons as well, and she lived to see them grow into the kind of men who picked up an old woman's fallen fan without being asked, and that, she thought, watching them, was the truest monument she would ever raise to the girl she had been, and to the mother who had made her, truer than any stone the north could quarry. And on certain evenings, when the northern wind came down off the moor and rattled the great windows and the fires were lit against the dark, she would take the grey cloak out and hold it, and remember a cold corridor and falling snow, and a sad dark man who had asked her name when no one else in 11 years had thought to, and had waited, and had crossed the whole length of England to walk with her up a hill. She had worn her plainest cloak to serve at a ball, and she had not known the stranger was the Duke. She had only known that he had spoken to her as though she were a person, in a world that had spent 26 years insisting she was not. And in the end that had been the whole of it. That had been everything. Not the title, not the valleys, not the great house in the north. Only a man who had looked at a girl in a grey cloak carrying a tray of wine, and had seen, where all the world saw a servant, the one face in the room worth crossing England for. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.